Okay, we are going to start on chapter 4 today. And this is really an interesting chapter because it's about socialization into gender. And the opening question in this chapter is, how are our lives filled with gender? As we're going to discover, they're very filled and it starts very early on. So we're going to begin with a very fascinating subject of gender and socialization. And that is, how do we learn to be a boy or a girl? And, think back to your early childhood. Hopefully, when you were reading this chapter, you were thinking back to your early childhood and whether you were, whether you were a boy or a girl, an important part of your memory. What kind of toys did you play with? What kind of messages did you get? Did you even think of yourself as having a gender? And then how did you learn it? How were those messages developed to you? So these questions are really important in exploring gender socialization. So first, let's look at the definition of socialization. And that is the way we learn to become a member of any group or society and even humanity itself. Every cultural group, every society, from the microcosm of the family on up, has ways of they have norms that are appropriate and behaviors to that society, and you've got to inculcate them into children and have them internalize them. So that's what socialization is, and it begins the minute we're born. And now, because we can determine the sex of a child before it's born, it begins before you're born. Okay. And just an aside here, I want to tell you what a joy it was and what a pleasure it was, unless you were deeply invested in having one sex child or another, to, it was like opening a Christmas package when you had your baby to find out what you got, what the sex was. You didn't know before historically. And so it was quite, that was part of the fun of giving birth and having a baby, was discovering that and finding it out. No preconceived ideas about what this little creature coming into your life was going to be in terms of gender until it was born. And so now, because we can tell, uh, it's even more important. Also, in those times before amniocentesis, um, showers, the baby colors were much more neutral. They were, pale greens and yellows, and you painted nurseries those colors too, off whites, pale green, pale whatever. There wasn't this deep identity with pink is for girls and blue is for boys at that point, to the extent that it is today. I'm not saying it didn't exist. I'm saying to the extent of today. So you had nursery colors, gifts had to be a bit more neutral. So people got practical things to a great extent. Even the clothing that you got for the babies were more neutral colors. Um, and then, of course, now we have gender reveal parties. I don't know if any of you have seen the research on some of the negative aspects of gender reveal parties that they've just been doing recently. It's kind of interesting. So um, it starts really early now. Gender socialization is my point. So although there's several theories about how gender socialization occurs, the general definition of gender socialization is the process through which individuals learn the gender norms of their society in order to develop an internal gender identity. So here's some other examples after babies are born that we do, because this is the reason I'm giving you these examples is because they demonstrate how crucially important it is to many parents, most, I would say, that gender identity gets solidified as early as possible. So to the extent of taping bows to babies' bald heads, little girls' babies' bald heads, so that immediately you identify that as a little girl. Or little tiny, tiny newborns wearing t-shirts with sports logos on them or something of that nature for boys. What happens when you misidentify a baby if they're not wearing those identifiers? I've done it. I don't know if any of you have. Probably it doesn't occur as often anymore. But you say, "Oh, what a darling baby. How old is she?" And you get these horrified looks from the parents and offended looks that, no, this is a boy, not a girl, or vice versa. So that's partially why there are those gender identifiers so very early on. Then I got to tell you the Fred Meyer toy aisle story, because I always used to ask my sociology students to see, and I'll ask you too if you get a chance, if you're in a store where there are toys, toy aisles, uh, just look at the stand at one end of the toy aisles and look down the girls' toy aisle and see what you see, and look down the boys' aisle and see what you see. The experience that I had was uh, seeing a family, a mother and a father, with about a 3-year-old little boy. And the little boy went down the girls' toy aisle and he was excited. He was looking at all the stuff and wanting to touch it and all that. The father grabbed him very roughly by the arm, yanked him out, and put him down the correct toy aisle, the boys' toy aisle, and said, "That's for sissies. This is your stuff over here." Well, now, if you know anything about children, you know that very young ones they're like little crows in terms of stuff that appeals to them, that's attractive, sparkly stuff. They've done lots of research on babies with showing them different faces, and friendly smiley face is cross-culturally. Babies love faces that are smiling and cheerful, and I get worried and afraid with faces that are grumpy and angry, that type of thing. So, if you look down a girl's toy aisle, you're going to see lots of sparkly things, baby dolls with very benign faces, lots of color. I acknowledge that much of it is pink, but there are many other colors, mostly soft toys, except for maybe the Barbies, which are plastic but have nice faces. They're pleasant and interesting and colorful clothing, etc. Now, look down a boys' toy aisle. What you see is a lot of camouflage, a lot of gray, brown, black in some cases, plastic, a lot of plastic, a lot of hard toys. I, in one store, literally saw toy hand grenades. And of course, you're familiar, I'm sure, with the toy guns and all of those kinds of plastic guns and things. What about the dolls? Are there any dolls down in boys' toy aisle? Yes, there are GI Joes often, and GI Joes are very grumpy looking. They're wearing camouflage. They don't have any interesting clothes on. They have very stern faces, as soldiers are supposed to have. So, of course, the little boy was attracted to going down that aisle. But watching the freak out that occurred after he did that was really fascinating and interesting. So you can be an amateur sociologist yourself by just observing things like that when you're if you have an opportunity to. So for a moment, let's go back to this definition uh, of socialization, which includes two important terms: norms and identity. So the gender socialization is the process through which you learn the gender norms of your society uh, so individuals, and so that's identity, learn the gender norms of their society to develop an internal gender identity. So let's look at the norms first, part of that definition. Gender norms are a set of rules about what is considered masculine and feminine behavior in a given culture, because it differs from culture to culture, as we'll learn as we go through the text. So, in sex role theory, which we talked about and learned in chapter 2, those kind of norms, gender norms, are at the center of a sex role. And that is the sex role is the expectations of behavior based on gender. That little boy blew the expectations of his father. He did not do what was considered the correct, expected behavior of a male by being interested in girls' toys. Now, gender identity is consistent with the individual approach we've learned about, and it focuses on how gender works from the inside out. So, gender identity begins in all societies from the moment we're born, as I mentioned, sometimes from before we're born. Um, so, it's very, very, very powerful. So, what about, for instance, this is called, the heading of this section is called Sorting It All Out, Gender Socialization in Intersex Children. So first, let's take the definition of intersex. And they are individuals who don't fit into the ideas of Anglo-American, Anglo and European, Anglo-European male and female bodies. Okay? They don't meet those expectations. And they're really important to the subject of gender socialization, norms, and identity, because they provide some really powerful insight into how we can tell whether a baby's male or female. So, how does this all work and come together? So, a medical definition is based usually on external genitalia, but some external genitalia is ambiguous. So there are a variety of intersex variations. You can look at table 4.1 to see what those are. And also there are, you can expand that definition to people who, with chromosomal or hormonal issues. And like Caster Semenya, I put up a video and a little reading for you about Caster Semenya, the athlete. She's a South African runner who had to take more female hormones to lower her testosterone levels so that she could compete in women's events. So those kinds of issues, chromosomal issues, the prevalence is estimated at 2 to 4% of babies that are born, and some inheritable types are as high as 1 in every 300 births. So they occur, it's hard to determine, but reliable estimates are 1 or 2 per 1,000 children. And then that's the physical differences. If you include hormonal differences, the increase goes up to quite a bit, as high as 1 in every 300 births. So what can we learn from intersex people? Well, first, that even a phenomenon that is more prevalent, this is so interesting, it's more prevalent than some other kinds of birth variations, like albinism, which is people who have lack of any pigment in their skin or their hair. So they're pretty much white hair, white eyelashes, very pale white skin. That's called albinism. And that occurs, that is rare than intersex differences. And it's so cystic fibrosis, Down syndrome variations that are very, very familiar to us and certainly cause less shame to parents. They are rarer than intersex and those hormonal changes, differences we talked about. So what can we learn from intersex people? First, it's interesting, as your text points out, that, why don't we change the categories of male and female to broaden sexual distinctions and definitions? Excuse me a minute, I'm going to click this off. Okay. We don't broaden those definitions, and we haven't, even though we're much more aware of those distinctions today. So one of the things is here that the study of intersex individuals is often at the crossroads of debates about the relative importance of nature versus nurture. This is it's such a huge debate in all like sociology, anthropology, psychology. How much is nature? How much is nurture? That as to who we become and our gender in this case. What they teach us is that there's a great deal of biological diversity that doesn't fit into prescribed sex categories. So, normal gender socialization begins at infancy. And as I've said before, by labeling an infant either male or female. But what if you can't label the infant either male or female? Okay. That creates a big issue, obviously, for the medical profession, for parents, for society in general. So now we're going to move into the theories of gender socialization, and we're going to begin with social learning theory. Think about that language, social learning theory. And it was developed from behaviorism. You probably, if you've taken a psychology class, very familiar with B.F. Skinner, and he was the founder of the social learning theory. You know, he worked with rats and dogs, punishments and rewards. You probably are familiar with a very famous study that he did, but he would feed dogs and then ring a bell while he fed the dogs. And after a few times, the dogs started to salivate before there was any food. When they heard the bell, they started to salivate. So that's an example of the social learning theory. And this theory is interested in exactly how we learn the behaviors. And the answer was through a system of rewards and punishments. Okay? And certainly when we're talking about sex socialization, we're gender socialization, that's in relation to sex-typed behaviors. So what are sex-type behaviors? A sex-type behavior is a behavior that's more expected and perceived as appropriate and normal, key points, when performed by one sex, but not when performed by the other. So, what that creates is a gender or sex role, which we have already discussed in a previous chapter. A typical example of that is crying. Okay? Crying is a sex typed behavior because it's okay for little girls to cry, and in fact, they're soothed and reassured and nurtured and hugged when they're crying. Is that they're rewarded basically for crying? Is that true for little boys? Generally not. No, not so. They're told that what? Famous movie, Boys Don't Cry. Uh, and they're punished for crying quite often, one way or another, not hit or that, but verbally told, no, you don't want to cry. That's not the way boys behave. So that's an example of a sex type behavior. Left to their own devices, boys would cry as much as girls. Okay, I mean, they're babies or children. They're going to cry when they're hurt or when toy gets taken away from them or whatever. So let's look at cognitive development theory now, and that's Jean Piaget, its founder. And he contradicted social learning theory because he said, no, children take an active role in their own socialization. They're not just passive recipients, excuse me. They take their own, they actually work at it themselves, and they do it through different cognitive stages that they move to. Piaget developed a system of cognitive stages that children work through based on age. And so, what that implied as children moved from babyhood to, adolescence, that they're not just little adults, but they're fundamentally different in how they think and feel and how they understand the world. And it changes from each stage they go through. So Lawrence Kohlberg very famous psychologist, used this model to create a new psychological theory of gender socialization. And he called that the cognitive development theory. Cognitive means knowing, right? It means thinking. So it was how you thought about and developed your sense of gender consciously. It explains how children acquire a sense of gender identity and gain the ability to gender type themselves and others. So, what are these stages of gender socialization that Kohlberg and Piaget talked about? Well, the first stage happens between about 2.5 and 3 years old. And that's when children acquire what's called gender identity, according to this theory, remember, okay? This is something that has to be learned. And at this stage, 2.5 to 3, they can identify their own gender and the gender of those around them, but they still might sometimes be confused and ask, is that a boy or a girl, about others to their parents or a teacher. But by the age of 5, they've attained what's called gender stability. They understand that society sees gender as permanent, doesn't change, and that the gender they are born with should remain so throughout their lives. That's around the age of 5. Okay. And it's not until the age of 7 that children reach the final stage, which is called gender constancy. And that's an understanding that even changing outward appearances, such as, say, costumes, wigs, makeup, doing plays, whatever, dressing up at Halloween, doesn't change his or her underlying sex category. They can dress up like a girl for some event if they're a boy, but they're still a boy. And that happens at around 7. So at that point, obviously, uh, you are going to look for and demonstrate consistent and appropriate gender identity behaviors. So that's the final stage, when you demonstrate congruent, with you, whatever your gender identity is, behaviors. That's called gender congruency. And that's also when one achieves what's called gender socialization. When you are congruent with the gender that you are, and I've got that in quotes, right? Okay, because this is a theory. Then that's called gender congruency, and you've developed your gender identity. Okay, so we're talking, around 7, maybe a little bit later at the final stage. So both the social learning theory and the cognitive development theory predate, they're old theories. They predate the broad influence of the second wave of feminism had on academic disciplines like psychology, and they're considered somewhat dated, as I just said. So here, the next thing we're going to look at is the gender schema theory. Now, schema is the same root word as scheme, okay? So a plot, in a sense. So there are 2 aspects to gender schema theory. The first builds on the frameworks of cognitive development and social learning theory. So the things we just talked about, this first schema, story, way of thinking about it, begins with those 2 ideas. And it was developed by Sandra Bem, B-E-M, she's in your text, who questioned why gender became more important in children's self-identification than other categories. It is than like race or religion or eye color. It is the dominant self-identifier for most children, and for most people, actually, too, adults. It would be, because it gets, deeply embedded at that point. What gender you are comes first. Okay. She called this Why Gender. It's a good name. Okay. So first we have to talk about what is a schema. A schema is a way of thinking and the associations that go with it that helps an individual organize their perception of the world. So you develop this story, this scheme, this idea of how things work. Okay. And in general, in relation to gender, specifically, it serves to organize this incoming information and perceptions from the outside world. Once again, you get this incoming information, boys don't cry. You internalize that. That's part of your story of what it is to be a male, or girls are nurturing, whatever. It becomes part of the schema, okay? And then the schema also include ways that different files, as your textbook puts it, the way the files in our heads interconnect. So the file mother is most likely connected to female, woman, feminine, nurture, caretaker, the rest, right? So, and that schema, that the word feminine includes all of the stories that go with being feminine, shapes the way we perceive the world around us, and certainly the way we perceive mothers, or the way mothers should be. If our experience of mother is not feminine, nurture, caretaker, then she's not, right. Because the schema is that female is all of those things, feminine is all those things. And that schema shapes the way we perceive the world. Since a schema is a way of seeing and shaping the world, then a gender schema enables us to sort the characteristics and behaviors into masculine and feminine categories. And eventually, they shape the way we, quote, see gender. And it's kind of like creating what Bem called gendered colored glasses. So the characteristics of gender schemas are really important, because gender is considered by almost, almost all cultures to be functionally important to society. In this way, that cultures are constructed to convince us that society can't function without the existence of sex and gender categories. Every society anybody's ever come across, studied, researched, lived with, has some kind of gender schema. Okay? They differ greatly, but they all have one. So in other words, gender pervades the way we think about the world. And that's across many other categories. It's a very basic, definitive, foundational schema. So an example in your text is, in experiments of sorting seemingly gender-neutral terms and objects into masculine and feminine categories. So in research, there's just a couple of examples here. Tender and nightingale, those words are seen as feminine when they do research. Assertive and eagle are seen as masculine. Okay? And then there's, of course, those of you who speak any of the, Spanish, French, Italian, and some other language, there are gendered nouns in many languages. We talked about that earlier. In Anglo-European societies, Bem, identified what she called androcentrism and gender polarization as the two important lenses that shape the way we see and understand this issue and the world. So, what's androcentrism? Andro is a Greek word for male. Centrism, central. So in androcentrism, it's the belief that masculinity and what men do in a culture is superior to femininity and what women do. And certainly we are a very androcentric culture. And then gender polarization is different poles, big difference between things. Gender polarization means that behaviors and attitudes seen as appropriate for men are viewed as inappropriate for women, and vice versa. Okay? It works two ways, and that's the polarization. So the two ways it works is that, first, it creates two mutually exclusive scripts for being feminine or masculine. which means that the script that's appropriate for men is only ever appropriate for men, and no script can be appropriate for both men and women. That's the first aspect of this. The second is that it stigmatizes any person who deviates from the scripts. A man acting, quote, feminine, a woman acting, quote, masculine. And Bem focused even more on the importance of what is called enculturation. How enculturation is a term that means how our culture becomes part of us, how it becomes to reside inside of us. Now, I want to point out that the script that's appropriate for men is never appropriate, etc. What I just said previously, and the stigmatization is still pretty strong, but the scripts are getting a little bit looser, as you're aware, I think. For instance, it's okay for dads to be loving fathers now and nurturing and affectionate with their children, which was not for many years in Western culture. So now we're going to move to psychoanalytic theory. And this is the final gender theory of gender socialization theories. And it's also a psychological one of the others we've looked at. So it begins, this psychoanalytic theory. It begins with the importance of women's status as mothers and uses principles from Freud and others to explain the ways that gender becomes deeply embodied in our personalities. So that makes it different from the other theories of gender socialization that see gender and the way we learn it as a behavioral acquisition based on socialization. No, 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 says Freud. It's deeply embedded in our personality because of women's importance as mothers. And so that's a very important aspect of it here. You can see that this is a deeply psychoanalytic theory. For psychoanalysts, gender is deeply embedded in our personality very early in our development. So in this theory, psychoanalytic identification is how a child modifies her own sense of self around some ability, attribute, or power that she sees in others, usually a parent. So, for example, rather than simply or just internalizing a miniature version of what a parent tells them is right and wrong, instead, because of this psychoanalytic identification, right and wrong becomes a part of the child's own sense of self. And because it becomes a part of your own sense of self, then you become self-regulatory about what is right and wrong. You don't need someone watching over you constantly to tell you, I'm talking about this theory, the cycle, to tell you what is right and wrong, because you have self-internalized that, right? You know right and wrong. Okay. The second concept is that of ego boundaries. You've probably heard this terminology. It's a term from Freud. And what that means, just think about the words ego, I, ego, boundaries. Okay. So it's a sense of personal psychological division between ourselves and the world around us. And what ego boundaries provide for us, they help us understand where the thing called me stops and everyone else begins. So a key point about why they're so important is that we're not born with them. Okay? They develop in early childhood. So if you've had a baby, I don't know where you're all at in terms of how old you are or what your situation is, but you know this as a mother. A baby has no, or a father, if you hang out with them enough and hold them and are close to them enough, a baby has no way of feeling that it is separate. That's why they get so worried when they're left alone, and they're not with people that they recognize their smells and their voices and that type of thing. They just they have no boundaries between themselves and their mothers, and this is a key point, whether they're boys or girls. babies. And that is also a survival mechanism because they are totally dependent for survival on their mothers and other people around them. But Freud focused obviously here on mothers. So eventually, though, of course, infants come to see that although they're completely dependent on their mother for survival, the reverse isn't true. That mothers have other concerns beyond her infant. And that's when they develop the concept that mother is separate from me. When they are old enough to begin to understand that although they are totally dependent on mother for survival, she's not totally dependent on them for survival. And that process, according to Freud and through later research in psychology, is different for boys and girls. That process of separation, of understanding that mother is separate, is different for boys and girls. And it gives us, according to the theory, radically different personality structures for men and women. Okay? So if you explore further, and this is more modern research and thinking, the gender of ego boundaries. Nancy Chattereau, I highly recommend her work if you ever are interested in this subject and have time to read it. She's author of the book, it's called The Reproduction of Mothering, and she's applying Freudian theory in this case. In that book, The Reproduction of Mothering, she assumes that after this ego separation, right, after the baby, very young child is old enough to get that mother's a separate entity, girls share, after that separation, girls share the same gender with their mothers. Now, granted, as your text says, that assumption doesn't fit with the case of trans men and non-binary people giving birth, but generally, female children share the same gender as their mothers. So because of this, girls experience a sense of connection with their mothers for longer than boy infants. Part of that is because the gender identity that girls need to learn lasts much longer. And it's also, I think this is a really important key point, it's much more readily available to girls than it is to boys. Girls don't have to change their concept of their own gender identity to identify with their mothers and relate to them. So girls can learn a sense of gender identity through direct personal relationship with their mothers. Much more difficult for male children to do that, and very young children. So the early years, looking at primary socialization into gender, we've now looked at various theories of how gender socialization should happen. We can now begin to look at, these are all theories back through history, right? Chattereau's more recent, I think it was the 70s she was writing, but so now we're going to look at how gender socialization actually does happen in various settings. So first is what's called primary socialization. It's the initial process of learning the ways that our society or group, and it occurs in early infancy and childhood, and it's transmitted through the primary groups to which we belong. So what's a primary group? Generally, it's our family, but the formal definition is that it's characterized by intimate, enduring, unspecialized relationships among small groups who usually spend a great time together. So family and, probably extended family to a certain extent, grandparents, aunts, uncles, possibly. And primary socialization begins even before we're born, right? Particularly today, as we talked about earlier. And it's because there are certain assumptions about gender, no matter which culture you're in. There are always these assumptions about gender that babies and children are socialized into. For example, the family name can only be carried by sons, or only the eldest son can inherit the whole estate, for example. Okay. Both of those are examples from other cultures, but the second one is called primogeniture in England. So you could be a lord and have four sons, and you're the lord of the manor, right? And you have hundreds of acres and millions of pounds. And guess what? Historically, only the eldest son would inherit everything. All the other girls never inherited anyway, but all the other male children had to go figure out something else to do. Okay, that's called primogeniture. The reasons vary from culture to culture, but these is, and oh, I'm going to go back a minute. Think about what that means to the kids, the brothers in that family. Okay, it's like one of them won the Powerball lottery, and everybody else gets nothing. Doesn't mean they're not loved or appreciated. They certainly have the benefits of wealth, but they can't inherit the estate, the titles, the whole thing. Okay? So the dynamics between the siblings and also the dynamics between the parents would be very different in situations like that. So the reasons vary from culture to culture that these assumptions exist about gender. But those assumptions and the rules have powerful impacts on the socialization of boys and girls. And for instance, research from the United Nations shows that boy preference, male preference for male children, in countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Algeria, Bangladesh, and Egypt, results in higher than average female mortality. Okay. Historically, in many cultures, sons survived at a much greater rate than the girls did. Uh, for one reason, in many cultures still today, the girls are fed after the boys are fed. Well, in cultures that aren't wealthy and don't have a lot of food, um, girls are, undernourished, which makes you more liable for diseases and sickness, etc. In some cultures, many, not more than I would like to think, the women, none of the women eat until, children or not, until after the men and boys eat. So there's also historical variations that affected how American cultures valued girls and boys. In the 1880s, for example, in rural areas, boys were preferred because of farm work. They were strong. And in the urban areas in the 1880s, they were favored because they could take factory jobs and contribute to family income. So it's very important to understand that the way gender socialization takes place and the particular form that it takes is deeply related to the type of culture that we find ourselves in. So on top of that, the relative value of boys and girls is only one part of the picture. Because as psychoanalytic theory indicates, the structure of family life is also important. So depending on different family structures, for instance, a three-generational family as opposed to a single parent one, there are very important differences in gender socialization due to the different expectations and tasks children perform. You could be, as a little girl, expected to do enormous amounts of work in a family. In some families and in many cultures, that's true. The little girls as early as 5 are carrying the babies, their sisters and brothers around on their hips and taking care of those kinds of things. So I put up a film for you about a video about gender neutral preschools in Sweden. And so we're going to look at that now to see how a different way of thinking about socializing in children into gender is happening in Sweden. And as your text says, although the family is a primary and powerful socializer of children, preschools are too. Okay? All schools are important socializers of children, but preschools get you when you're really, really young and when these messages are extremely powerful. Because part of the purpose of a preschool is explicitly to provide the socialization of young children in preparing them for future roles as students, and that just future roles in your life has to do so much with how you're socialized into gender. So the there's a book and documentary called Preschools in Three Cultures, which they talk about in this section, shows how young children in China, Japan, and the United States are very different. They're very different due to contradictory cultural values. For example, Japanese society emphasizes the importance of learning to work in groups, to be cooperative, right? Not individualism so much, but cooperation in groups. So very large class sizes in Japan are not seen as a problem the way they are in US preschools. Focusing on preschools in the role of gender socialization, by the way, is consistent with that top-down approach we learned about of the social learning theory. So you're getting you're getting socialized from the top down, from the grown-ups and the influential people in your life. So from the top-down perspective, it's parents, preschool teachers, and other adults who have the greatest influence on gender and socialization. Adults take an active role in shaping the way children think about and internalize gender. The Fred Meyer story again. That father took a very active role in it. Taking this approach, Sweden's emphasis on gender equality is very interesting to study, and it is. I think you'll enjoy the video. So gender equality is a really important value in Swedish society and in most Scandinavian societies, as you'll see here. It has remained among the top 5 globally of the countries with the most gender equality for 20 years, for over 20 years. And look who they come in behind. Coming in 5th, Sweden comes in 5th behind Iceland, Finland, Norway, and New Zealand in 2021. You'll notice there's no US in that list. The US was number 30 in gender equality. Sweden in 2021 statistics. Sweden has the highest proportion of women in the workplace in the world. Standard parental leaves are 480 days. 60 of those days are set aside for fathers. One Swedish children's clothing company removed the separate boys and girls section in their store, which is interesting. And table 4.3 on page 98 and 99, pages 98 and 99, compare the global gender gap scores for 50 countries for you to look at. So the Swedish experiment with gender neutrality, with gender neutral schools began in 1996 by Ingmar Jens, the quote, equal opportunity expert, which they have for different areas in Sweden. He wanted to break down the norms of the kind of stoic and unemotional Swedish man and decided that preschools were a good place to start because most Swedish children attend one because they're free or at nominal cost. And I thought that it was interesting that his interest in gender equality wasn't necessarily that his motive was greater gender inequality for women, but it was to break down these norms of stereotypical Swedish men behavior. So his research included videotaping teachers' interactions with children to identify any subtle biases on gender. And in one case, one teacher getting children ready to go outside helped the boys on with their coats and gloves while the girls were expected to dress themselves, or boys and girls were separated for different activities. Patterns like that emerged as teachers watched themselves on the video. So, and in 1998, Sweden added new language to the national education curriculum, requiring that all preschools, quote, counteract traditional gender roles and gender patterns, end quote, and encourage children to explore, quote, beyond the limitations of stereotyped gender roles. So in 2010, a gender-neutral school called Egalia, which is from the root equal, egalitarian, the name of the school is Egalia, was founded. It made the news because teachers did not use gendered pronouns like him or her. It's popular with parents and it has a long waiting list. Its goal is to make sure that all children are exposed to the full spectrum of qualities and activities normally seen as feminine or masculine. The quote here is, "We want the whole spectrum of life, not just half, for each gender." There are the same toys as at any preschool, but they're placed side by side, not separated into boys and girls toys. They're placed side by side to encourage children to play with them together and not self-select by gender for either boys' toys or girls' toys. And of course, not everyone in Sweden agrees with this approach, as you might imagine. And some refer to it as, quote, indoctrination, which of course, I love that they put this in the book, all preschools engage in. All preschools and schools' primary purpose is to socialize children into their society and culture. So here's what subsequent research shows, because remember that was 2010, Egalia was started. Research shows that attending preschools like Egalia does change the way children both behave and think about gender. They were more interested in playing with children they didn't know, for example, from another gender, or those from another gender than those in traditional preschools. They were less likely to engage in gender stereotyping than those in traditional schools. And going to a gender-neutral school didn't completely erase gender for children, however, and one wouldn't really expect it to. Children at preschools like Egalia still engaged in gender attribution. They still knew who were boys and who were girls. They put kids into a gender category. So even in one of the countries with the highest rate of gender equality in the world, gender still exists. And, it's impossible to eliminate it, of course, if you even wanted to. In their homes, watching TV, interacting with their family, children absorb, in all cultures and countries, absorb and internalize gender schema. And as the cognitive development theory of gender socialization suggests, children themselves become invested in a gender as a category, in what's called, as we learned, performing gender. But the differences that we talked about with Egalia, that they were willing to play with children of another gender or children they didn't know, etc., that's, very meaningful for their adult lives. They're going to be more open and less judgmental, that type of thing. I'm going to stop here and start a second video. This is a very long chapter, as I'm sure you are aware.